Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. There are a lot of newsmakers and topics that we don't have time to cover in any depth on the nighttime show. One man we've been wanting to talk to for a long time at some length is the governor of Florida, Ron Desantis. He's one of our first on-set guests for Tucker Carlson Today, and we're grateful to have him. Governor, thanks a lot for coming on.
Great to be here.
So you run this big, complex state filled with all kinds of different people, competing political interests at a time of real intensity in the country. What have you learned from that? What are the takeaways from it?
Well, I think leadership matters, and willingness to take decisive, strong action without being worried about your own shadow really makes a difference. I'll talk about the first part of my term, and then more recently with COVID. When I became governor, I fired Scott Israel, the sheriff of Broward County, who had mishandled the Parkland massacre a year before. I fired Susan Booker, the Palm Beach County supervisor of elections, who had botched a number of elections, and then also got Brenda Snipes from Broward County to resign. So those were very quick, decisive actions, and the results were, well, at least with the elections, we had one of the smoothest elections in the country in 2020. People at the time, it was considered controversial, but it was the right thing to do. Fast forward to COVID. You know, I had to make a lot of decisions that cut against the grain of conventional elite opinion, certainly the media. We took incoming every single day, but you make the decisions, you know why you're doing it, you stand your ground. And now we're in a situation where March of 2021, states wish they could have had Florida's performance. I mean, our unemployment rate is 4.8%. States like California are 9%. Our COVID mortality is less than the national average, even though we have the oldest population in the country. And we've had schools open, one of only 3 or 4 states in the country where 100% of our parents have access to in-person education. And so we got the big things right. In the moment, there was a lot of people that were throwing stones at us, but take the action, stand your ground, and hold the line.
So you went to Harvard, you went to Yale, you were a naval officer, you served in Congress for 6 years. You've certainly been around a lot of elite institutions. You ignored them as they criticized you.
Of course, yes.
Why?
First of all, when I first went to Yale, I grew up in Florida.
Yeah.
I was a blue-collar kid. I showed up my first day in jean shorts and a T-shirt, because that's what we wore on the west coast of Florida. Was a major culture shock. That was not something that was received very warmly, and I never quite fit in there, and it was a total culture shock to me, and I really rebelled against the leftist orthodoxy that I saw on that campus, and then when I see those in other institutions, and so I've always had a really strong distrust of some of the elites in American society, because I think they've gotten a lot of things wrong over the years. And so that was actually natural. I don't seek the approval of elites. I got elected by people here in Florida. Those are the folks that I was elected to serve. And I don't really care what people in the Beltway or in New York City think about what we're doing in Florida.
It's just interesting, though, because people who, you see it a lot, people come from some little town out in the provinces, and they show up at a place like Yale or Harvard Law School, or they become a naval officer, which I think is maybe not that different. It is an elite institution. And they decide, this is the world I really love. These are the values that I believe. It sounds like you came away from your experiences more contemptuous.
And appreciate where I came from, quite frankly. I mean, I remember going to Yale, sitting in class. I had never heard anybody criticize America. Like everything was about how bad America was in any of these classes. I never heard anybody, I go to church, I never heard anyone criticize God or Christian. And it was all, so Yale's motto is for God, for country, for Yale. They hated God, they hated the country, and they obviously had a weird way about going their institution. So seeing that was really eye-opening. And I realized very early on, this is not quite where I personally fit in.
What were the people impressive?
It's interesting because
very hard to get into those schools.
But here's what I would say. There are people that were smart for sure, but if you think you're smarter than you are, you got some problems. Even if you are really smart, and I think what I saw was people who were smart but tended to think they were a lot smarter and knew a lot more than they really did. And I think that there's a lot of danger in that. So I kind of learned early on, you got to have a little bit of humility. I mean, you want to be confident in what you believe and what you think, but there's always more information out there, and be careful of getting over your skis. And I think that has served me well.
Do you have any friends from school still?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Why'd you go into politics?
Well, it's interesting. I got into politics largely because of what Barack Obama was doing. So I got elected to Congress in 2012. I had written a book, and I didn't think it was going to lead to a congressional run. The book was read by about a dozen people, but it was nevertheless a book.
But they were avid fans.
Yeah, they were. And so criticizing Obama, his ideology, how that was really taking us in a direction I think the founders would not have intended. And it's interesting now, though, looking back on what I was criticizing Obama, he was a piker compared to what this woke left is doing now. I mean, back then, I always believed some of the stuff we see at our universities on campus, okay, once you get into the real world, none of that's going to fly. And I think that was probably true even a decade ago. Now, all that nonsense on the universities, that's running key institutions in our country, corporations, media, all these other things. And so I look back at my criticism of that, and in some ways it's kind of quaint because I think a lot of the threats that we face are much, much more significant to people who think like you and me than they were 10 or 15 years ago.
But we set up a system, it seems to me, where you take the smartest kids in the country, you identify them with standardized testing, and you funnel them into a small number of institutions, and you train them in effect for leadership. It's like what Sandhurst used to, do for the British Empire. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, like those are our leaders. And so if they're being taught things that are destructive, why wouldn't the rest of our institutions become destructive?
No, I think there's some truth to that. Although I could tell you, I think their role as really focusing on actual leadership has been probably that train left the station a long time ago.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean just in terms of if you go back to like World War II, I mean people from Harvard and Yale, they were serving in the war as officers. I mean they were leading parts of that. Now the people that are coming out, when I was at Harvard, I was the only person in my class to be commissioned in the military, out of 550 people. I think if we were 50 years earlier at a time of war, it would have been a little bit different. So you're not really producing people who are leaders, I think, in the sense of the founding fathers would have viewed it. You're really, I think, they're training people to have certain ideology and to carry a certain ideology into these institutions. And I think that that's something the chickens are coming home to roost on a lot of this right now in a way that I don't think I would have said 10 or 15 years ago.
What does your classmates want out of it? So you go to school with all these high achievers, for 7 years, and what did they wind up doing? Like, what do they want out of life, do you think?
It's interesting. I think a lot of them ended up just going into kind of some of the standard finance institutions, obviously with law, some of the elite law firms. I mean, I still think that's the dominant strand of folks who do that. You have others. I mean, I have friends who've served in politics. I have some friends who ended up going into the military. I have friends who've done well in law. I have some friends who've been entrepreneurs. So there's been a variety of stuff. But I think kind of the dominant cohort goes from those institutions to just a handful of cities, usually New York or San Francisco, Los Angeles, maybe Boston, and serve in a lot of the similar functions.
So the institutions they've gone into now reflect the politics of those campuses.
I think so.
The poison that is brewing on these campuses has infected the entire country, and we're all living with the results of that. What should we do about that?
It's interesting. I mean, I did a proposal yesterday in Florida about civics education to try to get this really front and center, to understand what America was founded on and understand how those principles have animated our history. But I said, we are not allowing critical race theory to be a part of this. Teaching kids to hate their country, teaching kids to hate each other is not worth 1 red cent of taxpayer dollars. And so we're drawing a hard line in the sand here in the state of Florida in our K through 12 system. And I think that that's important because, look, if you give people kind of the facts and you educate them on some of the core principles, if they go into a university system, I think they can probably make sense of what's really true and what's not. I think one of the problems has been we've been graduating kids out of high school who literally have not been given any information about what our country stands for or any of the principles that it was founded upon. So we're trying to do something about that in the state of Florida, and I think we're going to end up having some success.
So if you allow schools to teach kids openly racist ideas, like one race is better than another, which I thought we rejected, it shouldn't surprise you that the country falls apart. So, who would push back against your ban on that?
Well, I think some of the people, obviously, who are invested in that kind of thinking. And so you see some of it in Florida, you see some of it nationally where people are criticizing. What they'll try to say is, this is, remember in the presidential debate when Trump had taken a hard line against this, and it was categorized by the moderator as sensitivity training. that's a joke. It's not sensitivity training.
It's pretty insensitive.
Exactly. It's actively teaching to dislike someone based on the color of their skin. And so I think being honest about what it is, making sure parents are informed about it, and then letting them know we're not going to allow it in Florida, is a really big deal. I think some parents, when they see it, I think most of them are like, this isn't for us. But I think a lot of them really aren't sure what all this stuff is. And so we can't let the left try to act like this is some benign thing that they're just doing to do a little bit of diversity training.
Yeah, Trump, for all his good qualities, could never really explain it. He used about 3 adjectives over and over. It's bad. It's bad. True, but why is it bad? I think parents who confront it, of all ethnic backgrounds and of all political ideologies, kind of know this is really poison.
And let's just be honest about who is pushing this. These are white, progressive leftists that are pushing this. That's 100% of where this is coming from. This is not popular in most other communities in the United States, including in the African American community.
Right.
And so we just got to be honest about that. And I don't want our kids to be educated based on the whims of these upper class credentialed left-wing progressives.
So you see them as the wellspring of this stuff?
Yes.
So you don't have huge populations of those kind of people in Florida. There are some, but not a ton. Do you think that's part of the reason you didn't have the rioting that a lot of other places had?
It may have been, but I think we took a hard line on it. I called up the National Guard immediately. I said, we are not going to be having any of the rioting. We had National Guard. I had highway patrol teams ready to go. If they tried to take over a road, we went in there and made sure the road was operational. So we took it very seriously in a way that I think some of these other states just did not. And quite frankly, we had some local officials who did a good job. I mean, Carlos Jimenez is now a congressman.
Yeah.
He was the mayor of Miami-Dade County. I remember calling him. I said, Carlos, we can't let this happen here. He's like, don't worry. He's like, I remember when they had the riots in the 80s here. We're not going to do it. He was right there. So we were all working together to say, we're not going to allow this to happen here. So I think there may have been, maybe Florida's not quite as suited for it. There may be some truth. But I think it's how serious we were about it really did make an important difference.
How important do you think that is, the fact that there wasn't widespread rioting in the state, to people's decision to move here? You've seen a lot of people move here.
It's definitely been a factor, for sure. And I also think the fact that Florida wasn't locked down like these other states, I think the lockdowns, provided an impetus to be able, because people need an outlet to do things. And so I think some of these states like Minnesota, California, I think the fact that they were locked down and had the opportunity to go out and do stuff, I think that added fuel to the fire of what was going on. So I think the fact that we took a hard line on that, people understood Florida as a law and order state, but also that we were open, I think has been a huge factor in people moving to Florida.
So obviously you've had a lot of successes, you're a very famous governor. What didn't go according to plan? How did you screw up in retrospect?
Well, I think early on, I was just hungry for data. And so I was looking at South Korea, Italy, and I'm trying to make sense of this virus. It seemed to me that this was something that was risky for elderly people.
Yeah.
Didn't seem like there was much risk in people, not just kids, but even people who were in reasonably good health, who were, say, under 50. But I didn't really have the proof of that in Florida. So when they did the 15 days to slow the spread and some of that stuff, we followed that. Whereas I think if I had more data, I would have had the ability to say, wait a minute, why would we need to, close a gym for 2 weeks? I mean, these are younger people going to work out. If you're healthy, you're going to end up dealing with the virus better. And so I think that it took me a few weeks, March and into April, to get enough data to say, okay, we're not doing Fauciism. We're going to make sure our state's open. We're going to get the kids back into school, and we'll just focus our protection on elderly people who are the ones that are at risk for this.
So you've taken all this crap for not locking down. You're saying, in retrospect, you wish you'd locked down less?
Even some of the restrictions we did, I think, were ineffective. And this was what was being recommended at the time by the White House task force. Well, they recommended doing restaurants at takeout. They recommended suspending the gyms. And I don't think that those worked. And so once I figured that out, and one of the big ones that doesn't get talked about, suspending elective procedures at hospitals, because they said first that there was going to be hospital overflow. And I said, I'm not sure about that. They said, we're running out of PPE. They have elective procedures. You're going to run out of all this stuff. So I'm like, all right. So we actually, I think every state in the country suspended these elective procedures at hospitals. And we did it for about 4 weeks. And I'm like, the hospitals are half empty. We got to get this back. So we turned it on. So basically, anytime I did something based on, I think, an elite recommendation, if the data didn't follow that, I made sure I reversed course.
What do you think this is about? What these lockdowns? You got to think that some of them are driven by genuine anxiety about the virus and the effect it can have. But then you see measures remain in place despite mountains of scientific data. So you have to ask, what is the motive here? What do you think it is?
Well, I think that initially it was primarily driven by panic and fear. And I think some of these elites, these public health folks, there were these models being woven around, which all of them, by the way, were garbage. Neil Ferguson's model in Imperial College, garbage. The hospital models that Fauci used, garbage about hospital overflow. But nevertheless, they believed that. So they thought if they didn't take drastic measures, that we'd have 100,000 people in like New York that had no hospital beds. So I understand why you think that was.
So there were mistakes made in good faith.
I think a lot of it was based on that. The problem is they've never been willing to admit that they were wrong about this stuff. And there's nothing wrong with admitting, that you got things like, hey, I didn't have all the information. We did some things. I think it's probably better to maybe go in a different direction. Instead, they remain wedded in this lockdown frenzy. And I think some of these politicians, they put themselves out early as the savior of the public. We're controlling the virus with these draconian measures. And so if they were ever to lift them and the virus didn't then resurge, then people are going to say, well, wait a minute, you don't have the measures, the virus isn't coming back. Did we really need to do this from the beginning? I mean, for example, people point to Florida in a lot of these states now and say, wait a minute, California, you look at the last 6 months, California's done worse than Florida in every metric per capita, and yet Florida's completely open, and California's been locked down. How do you account for that? It's very difficult to account for it, but I think a lot of the folks who are so invested in lockdowns, they just don't want to admit they were wrong. They don't want to admit that some of the problems that they caused were caused in error.
But I mean, people are pretty understanding. Human beings make mistakes. If you continue to lie about evidence that everyone can read on the internet, you beclown yourself, you humiliate yourself.
Well, I think so, but you've probably seen some of these numbers about how certain segments of the population view the danger of the virus. And there's certain segments of our population, while the virus is serious, they way overestimate the danger, particularly to normal, healthy adults who are, say, under 50. They overestimate the number of people that would be hospitalized. There's a plurality, I think, of liberals that believe, or Democrats that believe, the hospitalization rate for people infected by COVID is 50% or more in a recent survey. And it's really about, of cases, it's like 2 or 3%. Of all infections, it's probably even 1%. And so when you see that, there's some of those folks who still believe the March of 2020 hysteria that was there, and they just haven't looked at that. And I think that's a function of what type of media you consume, some of the people that you talk to. But it's interesting because I think in Florida, see, one of the things what I didn't like about seeing these other places locked down is, yes, we focus on Newsom locks down this restaurant. That's bad for the restaurant, bad for the workers. Sure. But I think the average person, if they see stuff closed, I think that affects just the average person. It casts a pall over society when you see some of these things. And when things are open, I think people just feel better. They feel actually safer because they see other people going around and living their lives. And I mean, in Florida, people take reasonable precautions. But we give them the information and let them make the decisions for themselves. We're not beating them over the head every day with fines and penalties.
It does seem like there is intent behind some of the misleading statements that you're hearing from political figures, and I think it's making people paranoid. But I'm interested to know whether you think they're justified in being paranoid. I mean, if you crack down on the population the way that we're watching now, crack down on speech, try to disarm the population, scream at people, and then keep them indoors and off balance with COVID regulations that aren't justified by science, like, what are you doing exactly? Like, how much of this is designed to increase the political power of the people doing it, do you believe?
Well, I would say that when you're clearly advocating things which have not been justified on the basis of evidence, I think people are right to ask why. I mean, why be wedded to some of these things when what you said 6 or 9 months ago clearly has not come to pass? I mean, you said, for example, if a state like Florida was open, it'd be this unmitigated disaster. You've said if everyone wore masks 9 months ago, the pandemic would end in 6 or 8 weeks. and yet none of that stuff has ever happened. So why aren't you reevaluating it? And to me, if they're not willing to reevaluate it and admit they were wrong, that to me is that this is more about ideology. Some of it is, I'm not going to say benign, but like I think some of these public health people, they had been ignored for their whole career up until this point. Now all of a sudden, man, you get booked on CNN. Well, guess what? If you go on CNN and say, yeah, we've turned the corner, things are good, we're going to be fine, you ain't going to get booked on CNN again.
That's right.
If you go on and say, the apocalypse is right around the corner, and you up the fear factor, you're going to get an invitation back. So some of it, I think, with some of these public health people is about them, about their relevance, and really not wanting to let go, because the minute that they let go, then we end up in a situation where they will return to obscurity.
Do you ever wonder where it's going? I mean, this country is much less free than it was a year ago. It's not recognizable from the country it was 5 years ago. So extrapolate forward, where are we in 5 years? Seriously, like what does it look like?
If you go back to March of 2020, I mean, the number of people that were totally willing to just say, close churches, do all this, whatever, because they were really fearful. I mean, honestly, I was shocked at that.
I was too.
And I think part of it was they weren't having the data presented to them in a way that was accurate. But to see that was really, really jarring. And, you know, you go back, I mean, my election in 2018 was a bit important election for Florida, for governor, two very contrasting candidates. But none of us thought that there'd necessarily be a pandemic. But if you would have told me there will be a pandemic when you're governor, I would not have ever imagined that would mean a governor can lock everyone in their home for a year and close schools for a year. It would never have occurred to me that you would have. So governors have seized powers that I don't think are legitimate. And one of the failures in all this, I think, has been our courts, because the courts did not want to mess with this at first. They just wanted to have hands off, because I think they feared if they were to rule something unlawful and then something later happened, then they would be blamed. So they took a real hands-off approach on this for months and months and allowed a lot of these restrictions to really take hold. Now you've seen the Supreme Court do some stuff, but man, I mean, just think about it. You're in California, you can't go to church for a year in some of these places. Your kids have been locked out of school for a year, and there's no effective recourse. I think it's a real problem.
I mean, at some point, do people disobey? I mean, is there and no one wants to see that, of course, because you want order and you want laws to matter. But at some point, do people say, none of these regulations have been passed by any Democratic legislature? The democratic process has never really entered into this, and no, I'm not going to follow orders anymore.
And what we're doing in Florida is I've asked the legislature, cabin this stuff, because for me, look, I didn't abuse, but we have local governments that have done stuff that I've had to rein in. I mean, they had restrictions that I had to override because they were inhibiting our ability to put people back to work, get the kids in school, this stuff. So I think you need to do some legislative rollback and make it very clear. So I believe you shouldn't be able to close a business like this. I just don't think it's justifiable. Put out the information. Let people know if something like this is here, but then let people make those decisions. Instead, we're in a situation where some of these states have closed certain businesses for over a year at this point. How do you get your life back? Should your life and your entire livelihood and your entire liberty lie in the hand of the whim of one person, some governor that may not know what the hell he's doing? That's not the way our system was designed.
When does this end? Exactly. When do we declare victory over this, or declare a higher tolerance for the risk associated with it, and just say, we're going back to 2019? Sorry.
Well, I can tell you in Florida, we've got a big UFC fight happening, full capacity indoors at the end of April. We've got WrestleMania in April in Tampa. We're going to really do it. So our view here is you can make these decisions for yourself. We think that you should be able to do. I was walking down the street the other day. Someone came up to me, Governor, thank you for bringing live music back. We're one of the few states where you have live music now. So I think it's not going to be an even kind of return to normal. And in fact, if you talk to people that visit Florida from lockdown states, they will say it's almost like being in another country.
Yes.
If you go from Florida to Massachusetts. There are people, because people still got to do business and stuff. There are people who will want to do a business deal. They're both in Illinois. They will fly to Florida so that they can have dinner and talk business and come to an agreement, and then they both fly back to Illinois. I mean, that's what's happening in this country. It's insane.
It certainly is. And people who like to live under the boot of fascism will stay in their collapsing states, and people who don't will move to places like Florida. But over time, how does a country like that hang together? You said it's almost like a separate country. I think that's exactly right. I mean, is that a workable model for a union, say, 50 years from now?
I honestly thought after the election that Biden and the Dems would want to move forward to get. I mean, I honestly did, because okay, you used it against Trump, you demagogued it, okay, you got in there, so let's get the country moving again. And man, there's resistance to doing that. I mean, these schools, they're not going back in some of these places for this school year for sure. So then you're looking at the fall, but even they're saying with the fall, well, all the kids need to be vaccinated, even though the kids have been proven not to be at risk or be spreaders in any significant way. And so it is not ending anytime soon in some parts of this country. And I think it's a huge.
What should parents say to that? If someone says your 7-year-old must be vaccinated, what do you say?
No vaccine mandates. In Florida, we are making it available for people. No mandate for anybody, and we're also not going to allow any vaccine passports. The idea that you have to show proof of receiving a vaccine to be able to participate in society, I think that's anathema.
But you just point out that kids are not generally susceptible to the virus. They don't tend to pass it on to anyone. The vaccine, which seems like a godsend, is also pretty new, and we don't know that much about it. Like, should parents be eager to get their 7-year-old, absent other factors, vaccinated?
So I have a 4-year-old daughter. My son's going to be 3. My daughter's going to be 1 at the end of this month. We're not going to vaccinate the kids for COVID simply because they're at incredibly low risk.
Right.
And they're not at any risk really to spread it to us. And quite frankly, I'm at low risk. My wife's at low risk. I'm 42. It's fine. And so, so we won't do it for kids. Now, it's not approved for kids yet. They're doing different types of trials. But this is less dangerous for kids than seasonal influenza. That's just the fact. If you look in Florida over this winter, our hospital admissions for pediatric respiratory admissions fell off a cliff compared to what they were in previous flu seasons. And so, to me, we should embrace that. We should be thankful for that. I mean, imagine if COVID was the opposite and attacked kids in particular. I mean, I think a lot of us parents, we'd be really, really concerned about that. But the data is clear, the evidence is clear, and I think for school districts to go down the road of saying you have to mandate that these kids get vaccinated for COVID, I don't think that's based on good science, and it certainly, I think, would be a violation of people's freedoms.
What do you read for news?
It's interesting. There's different sites that I think have like the clips on them, and I have a bunch of different. But I read. We get the Wall Street Journal, but most of what I'm reading are sites that are aggregating different things. Right. And so you have. I used to read Judge Report. I don't read that anymore because it's gone off the deep end. So you got things like Citizen Free Press. You have you have Breitbart. You have. Some of these populist sites I think are doing really, really good. And then I read a lot of clips for different things that are going on in Florida, which are just basically aggregated from around the state.
Is that the first thing you do in the morning?
Usually, but I'll thumb through at night and then do whatever, and I try to get a workout in the morning. So we'll, and then obviously I have a lot of firsthand material that I get presented with in the morning, and so we focus a lot on that.
I meant for national news, right? Yeah. You're having all kinds of numbers from the state of Florida. Where do you think the media go at this point? You said most people who move here from other places are ignoring the media coverage of Florida because they assume it's dishonest, which I think it is. But is that sustainable? Can you have a country where nobody believes the news media?
I think it's a big problem. If you look, the kind of the corporate media has always had a liberal bias.
Right.
But if you go back 20, 30 years, it would always be through a liberal prism. But they wouldn't just do some of the stuff that they do now. They are actively partisan. And not only that, it's all about crafting a narrative, regardless of the facts. And so if there's a fact that's inconvenient to the narrative, they'll smother the fact. They'll ignore the fact in order to be able to continue with the narrative. You think about some of the stuff that's been put out since Trump's been president. Russia collusion, false. Jussie Smollett, false. Some of the stuff they tried to accuse, like Don Jr. of doing this or that, Cohen and all these bombshells turned out to be false. The phone call that Trump supposedly had with Georgia where they fabricated the quotes. Those aren't even real quotes. And so I think it's a big problem for democracy. Part of it, there's no accountability for the corporate press. I mean, they can do this with impunity, and no one really holds them accountable. I think their model is kind of smear their opponents for clicks. And I think that worked very well for them when Trump was president, because they were really playing to an enraged left-wing base. Well, now that we're in a different environment, you see the ratings going down. I don't know how the websites are doing, but I would imagine the traffic on those are down as well. So they got to figure out what they're going to do. Maybe it's attacking you, or maybe it's attacking me, or some of the kind of the directions that they go. I think they want to find something to be able to do. But I think it's way worse than it was 10, 15 years ago.
So what does it mean for you? You're running a state. If the Orlando Sentinel or the Tampa Tribune or whatever, St. Petersburg paper, attacks you, do you, sincere question, do you care?
No.
You don't care at all?
No.
Does it affect your life in any way? Does it move numbers? Does it convince people not to vote for you? Does it make it harder to get things through the legislature? Is it relevant?
So I think what it does is it probably hardens people that are not inclined to support someone like me with my philosophy or whatnot. But in terms of our base, they don't believe these newspapers anymore. They just assume there's an agenda behind it. And so in some ways, it can make it a little bit more difficult, someone me, because I know the narrative is going to, in some ways, be hostile. If I do something good, they're going to try to do it in a way that makes it seem not as good. But on the flip side of that, if I really were to screw up, my voters wouldn't believe the paper if they printed it anyway. So they've lost a lot of credibility, and I think they've lost the ability to really inform people who are just looking for information. So they're playing to more of a base. They become more overtly partisan, and I think the influence is more narrowed.
You married someone in the media, now that I think about it.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, and it's not just because my wife. The local news is probably the fairest
Yes.
Compared to the national media. I mean, obviously we have some good outlets like Fox that are fine, but and then the newspapers, I think, have become very partisan. I think the local news, you go, you do something, they'll put what you did that day, and they can ask me questions. That's fine, but that's all fair game. So what my wife did. And she also has insights, and I mean they're trying to turn around packages, they're trying to turn around stories every day as reporters, and so they really want the content. So I think that's been much better in terms of doing that. And I also think, quite frankly, local TV has way more influence than the newspapers do now. I mean, the newspaper circulations have just shrunk dramatically. I mean, some of these major areas of Florida, the circulations are probably a fraction of what they used to be. Whereas there's still a lot of people that want news. They'll just turn on the 6 o'clock news. So you still have that, and I think that they do try to hold an audience, and I think that they know if they were to become overtly partisan like some of the newspapers, that they'd probably hemorrhage viewers.
I got to ask you, there's this kind of weird interlude in your bio, which is this, ascent, all these impressive achievements, but then you take a year and you teach history at a boarding school. Why'd you do that?
And coach baseball.
Yeah. Oh, is that why you did it?
Yeah, I coached baseball. So, I think part of it was I'd played baseball my whole life. I played 4 years in college. I wasn't going to make a living at it. And I think part of it was, I didn't quite want to just walk away from baseball in some respects. I mean, I knew that I needed to kind of get on. So it gave me an opportunity to kind of still be involved with the game. And at that point, I was trying to figure out what I would do. I mean, I thought about potentially trying to go into maybe a front office type of situation at the time in baseball. Maybe go to law school and then maybe use that as a springboard to get in.
So you really loved it.
Yeah, I did. And then just being able to do college, I think I worked harder in college. I mean, I worked hard as governor. I worked hard in the military, all this stuff. But I mean, I played sports, which, you're training all the time. I'm studying and trying to do the best I can. And then I'm also working to help put myself through to make the odds and ends meet. And I just remember being really tired.
What did you do for work?
Anything imaginable. I was known as the most employable guy at Yale. Literally, people would call me, can you get a couple guys together? I got to put up fences, at the Yale Bowl, or I got to move pipes, or I got to do anything. So I did just about anything. I was one of the ball boys for the soccer team. Like when they'd kick a ball out of bounds, me and my buddies would go grab it and then put it back. Anything under the sun you could think about. And I'm making whatever, $6, $7, $8 an hour doing this, but I'm filling in as much as I can trying to do it. So there was just, I was a little bit tired, and I was like, you know what? maybe I just need to gather a little bit. Maybe coaching will be fun. So we did it, but then I knew. I mean, I had good marks and I had good scores, so I knew if I wanted to go to law school, I'd be able to do it.
What are you going to do next?
Well, we got a lot of. We're in the midst of our legislative session right now. We're going to have a lot to do. I mean, we have big tech. We're the only state really going after big tech. We're also doing some anti-Communist Party of China for some of the foreign influence, like these Confucius Institutes and things like that. Our budget's very healthy because our economy's doing good. So we've got a lot of victories we need to get there. And then we'll have the legislative session in January. And then I'm up again for the re-election in 2022. So we'll be focusing on that. And I think we're going to do really well.
If you somehow got appointed president this afternoon, what would your priorities be if you were running the country rather than just a state?
Well, I would secure the border, first of all. I mean, I think when you're in these positions, things happen on your watch. I mean, it's not like you control everything, but this is created because of what Biden did.
Yes.
And so you got to fix that. Trump had it right, so you got to do that. I would also do more. I mean, we banned sanctuary cities in Florida when I became governor. We did E-Verify for the first time ever, fought the business lobby to do that. I would fight for those policies on the federal level as well, because we've got to get this immigration situation under control. It's not good for the country to have this going on all the time. I also understand, looking at what President Trump had to deal with, this bureaucracy of ours. There's a lot of problems in that, and I think you need to be able to bring accountability to people in the bureaucracy. I mean, if Donald Trump's elected president, he tries to do policy, and the bureaucracy tells him to go fly a kite, that's not representative government. And I think we've allowed this to fester for years and years, and I think it's at the point now where even if a Republican wins the election, the other party still maintains control of the apparatus of the executive branch. And that can't be the way this goes. You go in, you have the ability to implement the agenda.
How could a Republican ever win a national election again with the changes they're putting in place?
Well, I don't think those changes are going to pass muster. I mean, in Florida, we would not abide by this H.R. 1. I think it's unconstitutional. We've proven we can run elections well. So we're going to continue doing what we're doing.
What do you mean you wouldn't abide by it?
I think it's unconstitutional. I mean, I don't think you can't come in and order me to conduct state elections in ways. Now, they're going to say, well, the federal elections you can do or whatever, but it would immediately be challenged in court. But I think our position would be it's flatly unconstitutional.
So the Democratic leadership of the Congress just moved thousands of armed federal troops into the Capitol as a statement that we're in charge now. So, I mean, does that concern you that the ruling party would use the military to shore up its political power? What does that portend for the future?
It's interesting. We at the very beginning of this, we had a request, which we typically get it from time to time, and we almost always fulfill these requests. Hey, we need troops for this, for this. So we sent people. And then after a couple days, we saw what this was all about, this half-cocked mission. They're sleeping on the floor. So I pulled them out. So my guys were there for a few days. And I was like, well, they're probably going to be there another week or so, but out of principle, we got to bring back. They're still there, and they're going to be there. So I think it's a big problem when you have the fencing around the Capitol.
Well, what kind of precedent does it set?
Yeah,
you can just call out the army or the reserves to shore up your position.
I think what they're doing too, though, is they want to use this January 6th. And try to basically politicize it. And they've equated it to 9/11 even. And so I think that they want it to be a symbol of the Capitol is under siege. We're having to work in this environment where they need to be sent home. The fence needs to come down, and everything will end up being fine.
What do you think, kind of big picture? You're obviously a smart person. What do you think? It does seem like the people who run the country are professional class kind of lost faith in the American project. They don't really believe in what their forefathers believed at all about the decency of America, the basic principles that undergird it and all that. How did that happen exactly?
Well, I think part of it is some of the stuff we talked about earlier about the education system and some of the people coming. But I also think that you have people in charge now. I mean, you look what they're doing. They're going to maybe overturn this Iowa election. You have a Republican that won, very narrow margin. She's seated, and they may overturn it. H.R. 1 is really just trying to guarantee that Democrats always run the country. So at some point along the line, I think with the left-wing elite, they thought that a Republican getting elected is just frankly illegitimate, and that they have a right to rule. And so I do think they reject the founding principles as well. But I think it's an entitlement that they think they're the ruling class. And how dare someone challenge them, particularly someone like a Donald Trump, which caused them to light their hair on fire. So it's a different mindset than maybe the mindset of the people that came in with like Jack Kennedy in like 1961, for example.
I would say very different. It's been interesting to watch you as governor, because one of the things that you talk about, you rarely hear Republicans talk about, and that's the state of the natural environment, water quality, for example. Why do you talk about that, and do you see that as part of conservatism moving forward? I
think so. I mean, so what I had to do, I'm in a situation where I have the best boating, fishing in the world, but that's threatened if you have problems with your water resources and your water infrastructure. And we had a situation where a lot of the progress was being upheld by these massive sugar companies. And so I came in and was really the first governor in a long time to be willing to break that up and to say, you know what, they're not going to set the policy anymore. We're going to set the policy. We've got to do some things to make sure, that we're not discharging water from Lake Okeechobee into our rivers, and basically it hurts this coast. It hurts these coasts. We need to replenish the Everglades, get it down to Florida Bay. Everyone wins when you do that. And so for us, it's really consistent with our way of life as Floridians, because people like to be outdoors. It's really important for our economy. It's important for property value. So it touches a lot of different things. It's not like, oh, we can never do something in some place that no one ever goes to or anything like that. No, the Floridians enjoy this environment, and I think we have a responsibility to God to leave it better than we found it.
But I mean, Republicans are for big sugar companies and big every kind of company. I mean, that's just kind of what we know, right? It's the corporate party. You're willing to say something different. Do you think that the future for Republicans will be less tied to corporate values?
Well, I think it has to be. I mean, if you look at these, well, first of all, with sugar, I was one of a handful, I think it was me and two others out of 27 congressmen to vote against sugar subsidies from Florida. And that's all the Democrats voted for the subsidy. So it's not just the Republicans on that issue. It really is bipartisan. The larger issue of kind of corporate America, look, if they're going to virtue signal, if they're going to engage in this woke type of stuff, if they're going to try to put a thumb on the scale into state and federal politics, that's something that we have to consider. And so one of the things that bugs me is they'll virtue signal on some of this stuff. They know the media will love it and give them praise. Meanwhile, they're engaging in horrific business practices overseas and doing all this stuff. So some of this is very dishonest. It's like a Chewbacca defense to divert from some of the things that they're doing. But we cannot be wedded to corporate America, both in terms of, I think, solid economic policy. That's really not, I think, what traditional conservatism really should be about. I think the D.C. Republican Party just kind of naturally would fall into being a corporatist party. But I don't think that was Reagan's vision. I don't think that was Coolidge's vision and some of these other folks. But then we also have to understand, these companies are standing for values that really are not middle America's values. And so why would we want to put them in the driver's seat of national policy? So yes, it's big tech. Yes, it's some of these other companies. But I mean, even like, you see what like Coca-Cola is doing with critical race theory. I mean, some of this stuff is just absolutely insane.
Why isn't this more obvious to other Republican office holders? I mean, you just saw the other day a Republican governor, a pretty solid conservative, basically take the side of big companies against her own state, against her own voters, against her own legislature, which is controlled by Republicans. Is that just reflex? I mean, have people not sort of paid attention for the last few years? Or why is that happening?
It may be some of that. I mean, I think that some folks may fear, like, if you take a strong stand, how are these companies going to react? I flip that on its head and say, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that I shouldn't stand for the right thing because a company may then try to punish us? So what you're saying is the company should run the state. I don't think that that's what most voters want. They don't want these big companies running the state. So look, we're in a good situation in Florida because we have a massive market. So it's a little easier for me to say, hey, we need big tech accountability because there's billions and billions of dollars in this state. I mean, people are going to service this market one way or another.
Do you worry about a state like Texas, which has just been filled with refugees from California, upscale refugees, bringing a lot of money, but also bringing their values. Like, what does that mean for the future of Texas, and how do you think about that as you think about the future of Florida?
Well, I think if you look in Texas with Austin, they bring these tech companies, some of these other companies, and I think the executives understand why they're moving to Texas, but I think a lot of the employees, they do the same ideology they had in California. So a place like Austin, I mean, it's kind of like a mini San Francisco with the homelessness and some of these problems. So they are repeating the policies and reproducing those policies in a different state. And I think that definitely has made Texas more competitive. I think Florida's been a little bit different. I mean, in a couple respects, some of the industries that we're doing really well on are a little bit different than those California-based companies. I mean, we're doing really well on space and aviation. There's a lot of blue-collar jobs that go with that. We're doing well with financial services, which I still think, even though some of it's a lot of it in the Northeast, I still think leans more right than left. And then we're really working hard on manufacturing. We're doing a lot with vocational education. I say, you do not need to go to college to be successful. If you want to, fine. That's where your dreams take you. But man, we've got ability for these people can make $100,000 a year in their 20s if they learn a trade. And then I think we tend to get people who are kind of retiring to Florida because they appreciate the environment that we have. So I think the migration is just different than what we've seen in Texas. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, Florida was one of the states where Trump did better than he did in 2016. He did 3 times the margin in Florida in 2020 than he did in 2016, even though in a lot of these other states the margin was a little bit less. So I think that's an indication that I think our migration patterns are a little different politically than Texas.
Who are your heroes? Who do you think of as genuinely impressive as a model for your behavior politically and in life?
Well, I think the greatest public servant that's active today is Clarence Thomas. I think part of it is, I mean, he sets the standard. What he went through, just that ridiculously unfair treatment, and he stood strong through that. I think a lot of people would have wilted. But he gets in there and he does the right thing. He does not give a rip what the Washington Post or the New York or any of that think. I mean, he's going to show true north time and time again. And if you look at these decisions when they come out of the court, you ask, where's Thomas? And 99-point-something%, wherever he is the direction that you want to go. And I think obviously he's got an incredible life story from his beginnings in Pinpoint, Georgia, segregated South. But then the fact that he took from that a love of America. If anyone should not like America, it should be someone like Clarence Thomas. But yet the people that don't like America tend to be the people that have had everything handed to them. And so here he was. He actually had his family, his grandfather struggled. He had to do it. But what he came to understand is it's a great country based on great principles. And we've done a lot of things to make life better for people. And when there's injustices, you can correct them. So I think he's a model. Look, if he had the ideology of the ruling class, he'd probably be on the $10 bill right now for his life story. But he's gone another way. He knew that wouldn't lead to some of the accolades in elite society. But I think he's doing it because he believes in the Constitution.
Who do you listen to? I mean, you've got to make all these decisions. Who do you consult? Whose opinion do you take seriously in your life?
So, I mean, my best friend's my wife.
Yes, famously.
She's a great spouse, a great mother, but I think she's just got a great, I would say like a BS detector. I mean, like she really can kind of see through some of the stuff that happens. And so if she were to say something that's like, oh man, I'm not sure about this person or that, I'm going to think twice then about that. And so she's been wonderful. I mean, she's worked her tail off. When I first ran for Congress, I started with no name ID and no money. I was in a 7-way primary. We both knocked on thousands of doors. To this day, people will come up to me and say sometimes, hey, you knocked on my door. But usually it's your wife knocked on my door, and that's why I voted for you back then. And so she's been incredible. I have friends over the years that I've known for 20, 25 years who, and my view on that is, when you get to be in a position like governor, people's motivations for wanting to deal with you, you don't necessarily know. But if I knew someone 20, 25 years ago and we've been friends this whole time, I'm pretty confident, that they're folks that are going to give it to me straight and that really have my best interests at heart. So I do have a number of those folks. And then I've got some good folks that I work with in the governor's office, people that are really smart, really hardworking, and have really helped us, get to where we are in terms of the achievements that the administration's been able to accumulate.
Last question. I'm just interested, since you obviously pay attention to what's going on nationally. So, Democrats win in this last November, 2020, and rather than kind of taking a victory lap or celebrating their total domination of the country, they got madder. And it was almost like you win a tennis match and then you leap across the net and beat your opponent to death with your racket. What was that impulse? Why did they get angrier when they won?
I think they have a fraction of their base that is just perpetually angry. I think they're very online. I think they're very caustic and nasty. And I think unless they make us a complete socialist country, these people are never going to be happy. And I think that even though Biden's been the most left-wing president of our lifetimes, I would say,
ever.
I think, even more than LBJ, because, LBJ wasn't as left-wing on the culture as Biden is, and Biden's an aggressive left-wing culture warrior. But I think anything short of complete domination of conservatism, making sure people that have conservative views are shut out from anything short of that, they're just not going to be happy. But I think the problem with the Democrat Party and the reason why, they have 50 senators, a bare House majority. This is not a landslide election for them when everyone was predicting that. I think they're captive to that part of their base, and I think that's ultimately going to be their undoing in 2022, and then I think probably in 2024. So I know people were upset about the election, and it feels like we're under siege from all the stuff coming out of Washington and the media, and I get it. But I do think there's going to be a reaction to this, Tucker. There's just too many people in our country that are good people, decent people, that love what America stands for. And I think you see it in these special elections already. Republicans are turning out. And I'm not suggesting everything's about the elections, because there's way more in our society we need to be dealing with that has nothing to do with elections. But I do think 2022 has an opportunity for us, to be a big statement and to show that you've gone too far.
I know you're not a shrink, but what's your explanation for that personality type? Like, people win, they get madder, they're not happy until they dominate everything, until their opponents have been silenced. Do you have those feelings within yourself ever?
No.
I don't either. Where do those come from? What is that?
I do think it's a totalitarian impulse. I think it's an impulse that you probably go back with some of the stuff with communism and some of these things. There's a philosophy and ideology about that, but then there's just an impulse to dominate other people. And I think that that's just something that's been prevalent in society. And I think that, you look at what someone like me, I'm trying to do. I want you to live your life. I have no interest in locking you down and doing that stuff. I want you to be able to do stuff. But there's, on the flip side of that, there's other people that just feel very differently about it. And just think about the impulse. If you're walking down the street, walking your dog, and you don't have a mask on, and someone's on the other side of the street with a mask, and they will storm over to you and yell at you for not having a mask on. I'm just thinking to myself, if you're worried about them then wouldn't you want to just stay away from them and mind your own business? But the impulse is, you need to be obeying, you need to be doing it.
So in cases like that, and I think that's a real example, what are the chances that the person who storms across the street to scream at you about a mask hates his father?
As you said, I'm not a shrink, but I think that...
Oh, but go ahead and play one just for a second. Do you think there's any chance that person has warm feelings about his own dad? Honest question.
I think that this is clearly something beyond just, politics about whether taxes should be high, taxes should be low. But I think that, this is one part of it, but it encapsulates the moment. I think that 20 years ago, we would view losing an election being terrible because, the taxes would go up.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's not important. But man, we're talking about things that are just much more fundamental to a society now. The underpinnings of the culture, the role of faith, all this stuff. And I'm not an alarmist, but man, there are way more threats to all this stuff right now than even 10 or 15 years ago. And so that's when I talk about what we need to do. I say different things, big tech, all this stuff. But you do got to have a backbone, because there's a lot of power and forces in our society that are against.
Who's on your side, by the way? So if big tech and the Democratic Party is a one-party state right now, and the government of China and every big corporation, if they're all against you, then who is for you?
Oh, man, the cook at the restaurant, the small business owner, the mom who was struggling with their kids not being able to be in school as their kids in school, a lot of folks who've retired to Florida, lived a good life, and really believe in America. So They may not be the loudest people in society, but they're there. And when I'm out and about in Florida, people come up to me and they're really genuinely appreciative of Florida.
But their only power, you're basically saying voters are on my side, and you won, so you can say it with credibility. But so you really believe in the end democracy wins, that the power of the vote in the end is enough to stand up against the institutional power that opposes you?
I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. I mean, I think that when you look at some of the things that we discuss with the civics and teaching people about the United States, some of the way that the culture operates, I mean, I think you need to have more involvement in movies and entertainment and all this stuff. There's a market for this. People need to do it. So I don't think it's sufficient, but I do think it's necessary.
Governor Ron Desantis, I appreciate you taking all this time. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Governor, thank you. And thank you for joining us on Tucker Carlson Today.